Welcome, dear literature enthusiasts, to a gathering of minds where cinema becomes more than entertainment and transforms into a dialogue with our inner lives. Tonight, I want to open a door to a film that has always felt like a quiet conversation with myself, one that echoes with the idealism of youth and the sharp sting of reality. The Rainmaker, 1997, may appear at first like a simple courtroom drama, a story of lawyers and lawsuits, but beneath the surface it carries the bones of something more profound, a reflection on morality, justice, and the fragile line between hope and disillusionment. Before we dive into this layered journey, let me take a moment to thank you for being here. If you're someone who loves peeling back the skin of a film to examine the beating heart beneath, if you've ever stayed awake after a movie, thinking less about the plot and more about what it stirred in your soul, then you found the right place. Please do like and subscribe, not out of habit, but so we can keep building this space together, a little community of thinkers and dreamers. And as always, a note: what follows is not a straightforward review. It is a critical, theoretical exploration meant to illuminate the film for those of us who approach cinema with a literary eye, as students of narrative, character, and meaning. I remember the first time I watched this film, curled on an old couch with the sound of rain pattering outside. Perhaps that coincidence deepened my connection to it, because the story itself feels like a storm. A young idealist stepping into a system far bigger than he ever imagined, fighting to hold on to his convictions even as cynicism surrounds him. I had just finished a semester on American literature, reading authors who wrote about the fragile dance between the individual and the institutions that sought to shape them. Watching the story unfold, I couldn't help but feel as though those themes had leapt from the page into the screen. The narrative became a mirror, not just of the legal system, but of the timeless struggle between innocence and corruption, hope and resignation. It was less about law and more about life, less about legal victories and more about the courage to endure. The film introduces us to a young man standing at the threshold of his career. He's armed with education, ambition, and a conscience that still believes in fairness. Yet the world he enters is no classroom. It is a brutal marketplace where human suffering becomes leverage and morality is negotiable. This juxtaposition struck me deeply when I first encountered it. I thought of the times I stepped out of academia, carrying lofty ideals into spaces that valued expediency over truth. There's a shattering moment when you realize that principles are heavy and that carrying them often means walking uphill while others glide downhill. This film embodies that sensation perfectly. The overview of the story is deceptively simple. A young, inexperienced lawyer takes on a massive insurance company in a David and Goliath battle. He is underpaid, underprepared, and underestimated, but what he has, what no amount of cynicism can strip away, is heart. He isn't just fighting for a paycheck or for prestige. He is fighting for the lives of ordinary people whose voices are drowned out by bureaucracy and greed. At its core, the film asks whether decency can survive in a system designed to grind decency out of you. This question doesn't just belong to lawyers. It belongs to all of us, anyone who has walked into a workplace or an institution and felt the tug between doing what is right and doing what is safe. The beauty of the narrative lies in its characters, and in how the plot balances personal journeys with larger themes. The protagonist's clients aren't abstract cases. They're human beings, frail and frightened, clinging to him as their last hope. In particular, the family at the center of the lawsuit, struggling against the cold indifference of an insurance giant, becomes the film's emotional anchor. Their pain is real, their desperation palpable, and watching the lawyer grow into his role as their advocate becomes as much about his transformation as it is about theirs. This is what makes the story resonate. It isn't just about a case. It's about the courage to give voice to those who are voiceless. I think often about how literature and cinema meet in moments like these. The narrative reminds me of the tragic optimism of Fitzgerald, the moral intensity of Steinbeck, and the weary honesty of Twain. It is a courtroom drama, yes, but it reads like a parable. The villains aren't cackling caricatures, but polished professionals who have perfected the art of cruelty through indifference. They represent systems, not individuals, systems that thrive not on malice, but on apathy. This is where the film strikes hardest, in showing how ordinary people are crushed not by monsters, but by institutions that look ordinary, even benign. It makes us ask ourselves where we've seen such systems in our own lives, and whether we, too, have turned away when their victims cried out. As the plot unfolds, the story tightens like a noose. The courtroom becomes a stage where hope and despair wrestle under fluorescent lights. Our young lawyer faces opponents who know every trick, every loophole, every weapon the law can offer. He is not just outmatched, he is outnumbered. And yet, the narrative delights in showing us that wit and integrity can sometimes cut deeper than cynicism. Watching him find his voice is exhilarating. Not because he wins every battle, but because he refuses to surrender his humanity in the process. That's rare in cinema, and rarer in life. The plot, brief though it may seem in outline, brims with energy. The lawyer takes on a case that appears unwinnable, a young man dying because his insurance company denied a life-saving claim. It is the sort of case that seasoned lawyers would pass over, knowing the costs outweigh the benefits. But this protagonist cannot look away. In representing the family, he pits himself against an army of corporate lawyers with infinite resources. What follows is a series of small victories and crushing setbacks, each moment tightening the stakes. Along the way, he navigates not only legal battles, but moral ones, whether to compromise, whether to exploit, whether to harden his heart. The narrative teases us with the promise of triumph, then pulls us back into the reality that justice is never clean, never guaranteed. And then there are the twists. One of the film's most striking moves is how it shifts the measure of success. This is not a story where winning the case automatically means victory. The real triumph lies in preserving decency, in refusing to become as callous as the enemies he fights. At one point, when the legal tides turn in his favor, the victory feels bittersweet, because what has been gained can never fully erase what was lost. This, too, echoes the best of literature, the idea that triumph and tragedy often coexist, that justice is never pure, and that moral victories sometimes matter more than legal ones. For me, the resonance lies not only in the narrative but in the worldview it affirms. It speaks to those of us who have stood in small corners, facing opponents larger than ourselves, and wondered whether it was worth it to keep fighting. It suggests that the answer is yes, not because victory is assured, but because the fight itself preserves our humanity. It reminds me of nights I spent wrestling with choices that felt impossible, moments when compromise seemed the only path forward. This film whispers that sometimes compromise is surrender, and that holding on to principle, even when it costs you, is its own kind of victory. The story also teases us with glimpses of personal transformation. The lawyer enters the narrative as naive, idealistic, almost foolishly optimistic. By the end, he is seasoned, scarred, and sobered. Yet he is not broken. This balance of growth without surrender, of loss without destruction, is what gives the film its lasting power. It is not about a man who wins a case. It is about a man who discovers who he is when the world tests him. As I look back on this film, I realize that its greatest strength is its invitation. It doesn't simply tell a story. It asks us to examine our own. Who are we when confronted with corruption? What do we do when our ideals are tested? Where do we stand when compromise feels easier than conviction? These questions are not confined to courtrooms. They belong to classrooms, boardrooms, living rooms. They belong to us. And so, dear friends, as we prepare to wander deeper into this analysis, let me leave you with this thought. The film is less about law and more about life. It is less about verdicts and more about values. It is less about victory and more about the quiet, stubborn refusal to abandon decency in a world that makes decency costly. If you carry these questions with you, if you, like me, find yourself haunted by stories where small acts of courage ripple outward, then this film will linger in your heart. It may not give easy answers, but it offers something rarer. The reminder that integrity is both fragile and indestructible, fragile in its vulnerability, indestructible in its worth. This has only been the beginning of our journey together through this story. What lies ahead is a deeper dive into the currents that shape it, the characters, the symbols, the techniques, the strange truths that emerge when we look closely. But for now, let us sit with the storm, with the rain, and with the quiet courage of one young man who dared to fight. The story begins with a quiet kind of tension, the sort that doesn't announce itself with explosions or fanfare, but instead seeps into your bones, reminding you that life's most important battles rarely begin with fanfare. We meet a young man just out of law school, carrying more hope than money, more idealism than experience. He has studied the law, memorized the doctrines, highlighted the casebooks, but none of that can quite prepare him for the blunt force of reality waiting just outside the classroom door. He is broke, living in a shabby apartment, working odd jobs to get by. His dreams of being a noble defender of justice are already bruised before they've even begun. The first half of the story builds on this theme of disillusionment. Our protagonist steps into the world of practicing law and finds it nothing like the noble visions he once held. The firms he approaches see him as disposable, another cog in the machinery of profit. When he finally finds work, it is under a lawyer more akin to a hustler than a scholar, a man who chases ambulances, hangs around hospitals to lure in accident victims, and treats law like a sideshow. The young lawyer is disgusted but trapped. He needs experience, needs money, needs something to cling to. Already, the system that promised him purpose is nudging him toward compromise. I remember watching this and thinking about the first time I entered a workplace that didn't match my ideals, the first time I realized that ethics and economics rarely shake hands. That pang of disappointment, of realizing that the noble thing is often the least practical thing, makes this section sting with familiarity. The film is careful not to rush here. Instead, it lingers in the small humiliations, the long hours of paperwork, the degrading errands, the patronizing advice from men who measure worth by billable hours. Each moment chips away at the protagonist's optimism. Yet it is in this environment of cynicism that he discovers the case that will define him. An ordinary family walks in, ordinary in a way that makes them invisible to the powerful. They're poor, tired, and desperate, their hope pinned on him almost by accident. Their son is dying of leukemia, and the insurance company has denied the claim for a bone marrow transplant. It is the sort of case seasoned lawyers avoid. Too messy, too difficult, too unlikely to succeed. But something about their quiet desperation stirs him. Perhaps it's his own mother's voice echoing in his conscience. Perhaps it's the residue of the ideals he thought were lost. Whatever it is, he agrees to take them on, and in that decision, the narrative locks into its true trajectory. From here, the first half becomes a duel between naivety and cynicism. On one side, a young lawyer clinging to principles. On the other, a corporation polished to a mirror sheen of indifference. His opponent is an insurance company, so large it practically seems like an empire, represented by lawyers who are slick, ruthless, and endlessly resourced. The contrast is brutal. One man with no office, no money, no staff beyond a mismatched group of stragglers, pitted against an army. It is David and Goliath with paperwork instead of stones. The courtroom sequences begin to take shape here, though at first they are small, almost procedural. He files motions, only to be dismissed with smirks. He tries to meet deadlines, only to be outmaneuvered by seasoned professionals who know how to stall, distract, and drain resources. Each setback feels like another lesson in futility. Yet instead of breaking him, each defeat steals him further. I've often thought about this aspect of the story as a metaphor for early adulthood itself. The way we stumble into systems we don't fully understand, get knocked down repeatedly, and only through persistence begin to learn how to push back. There are other threads woven into the first half, each deepening the portrait of a man at war with himself and his world. A fragile romance blooms between him and a woman trapped in an abusive relationship. Their encounters are hesitant, tender, shadowed by violence lurking just outside the frame. She represents both hope and danger for him, A reminder that the pursuit of justice is never only in the courtroom, but in every human connection we choose to honor or betray. Their growing bond adds emotional stakes to the story, showing us that his struggle is not merely professional, but personal. That who he is becoming as a lawyer is inseparable from who he is becoming as a man. The presence of his mentor, a flamboyant older lawyer, provides another layer. This mentor is part clown, part philosopher, guiding him with a mixture of cynicism and affection. He knows the game, knows how corrupt it all is, but delights in watching the young man cling to his principles anyway. Their dynamic is one of the most fascinating aspects of the first half. The weary veteran amused and almost envious of the rookie's unbroken spirit. He warns him repeatedly that decency won't win cases, that compassion is a liability. And yet, in his laughter and his half-serious advice, we sense admiration. Perhaps he sees in the rookie a version of himself long buried. The narrative tension grows as the case begins to gather momentum. Depositions are taken, affidavits filed, the machinery of law grinding forward. The insurance company remains dismissive, confident in their ability to crush opposition. But cracks begin to show. The company's indifference, its arrogance, its blatant disregard for human life, all of it becomes ammunition in the hands of the young lawyer. Slowly, painfully, he learns to turn the system's weight against itself. It is not brilliance that propels him, but persistence, the stubborn refusal to be cowed. In one particularly striking moment, he sits across from the dying boy's parents, watching them clutch photographs and medical reports. Their grief is so raw it silences him. He realizes then that this case is not about legal precedent or even about money. It is about whether ordinary people can stand against institutions designed to erase them. That realization shifts the weight of the story. It is no longer a battle of strategy, but of morality. The courtroom becomes a stage where not only evidence, but conscience will be on trial. The first half closes with the sense of storm clouds gathering. The case is heading to trial, the odds stacked impossibly high. Our young lawyer has learned enough to know the road ahead will be brutal, but not enough to know if he can truly endure it. His romance deepens, but is shadowed by violence he cannot entirely shield her from. His mentor laughs, but grows quieter, sensing the stakes. And the insurance company, smug in its fortress, prepares to unleash its full arsenal. Watching these moments, I always feel that the first half is less about law and more about awakening. It is the story of a man realizing that ideals only matter if they're tested, that courage only means something when it costs you. The pacing, the atmosphere, the quiet accumulation of setbacks and small triumphs all lead us to the precipice of the trial, where everything will be decided. And though the outcome remains uncertain, the path is now clear. This is no longer about winning or losing, but about refusing to surrender decency in a world that profits from its absence. The second half of this story carries with it the full weight of everything that has been building. The quiet humiliations, the small victories, the bruised hope that somehow decency can prevail. By the time the trial begins, the young lawyer has been stripped of any illusion that the system is fair. Yet he walks into that courtroom with his head high, a file clutched in his hand like a shield, carrying not only the case, but the fragile trust of a family who has nowhere else to turn. For me, this transition from preparation into the crucible of trial always feels like a deep breath before a plunge. You know the water will be cold, you know it will sting, but there's no choice but to dive. The courtroom itself is staged not as a temple of justice, but as an arena. Opposing counsel arrives with their army of paralegals, stacks of files, and a smugness that radiates off their polished shoes. They know the game, and they know how to bend it. They twist procedures, object with practiced venom, and smirk at every stumble the rookie makes. And stumble he does. His opening arguments are awkward, his nerves obvious, his words trembling. But what he lacks in polish, he makes up for in sincerity. He speaks less like a lawyer and more like a son, a neighbor, a friend. And the jury, though not yet convinced, leans in. This is where the brilliance of the narrative shines. The trial is not only about evidence, it's about transformation. Each day in court shapes him, chiseling away his fear, sharpening his instincts. He begins to find his rhythm, to understand that law is not only about technicalities, but about storytelling. His opponent wields statutes like weapons, but he learns to wield humanity. He tells the jury not only about contracts and clauses, but about a boy dying while a corporation counted its profits. He puts faces to the paperwork, names to the policies, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the tide begins to shift. The tension rises with each witness. Doctors testify, paperwork is dissected, corporate representatives squirm under questioning. The insurance company, once untouchable, begins to reveal its rot, its coldness, its bureaucracy, its utter disregard for human life becomes visible not only to the jury, but to us. Watching these sequences, I felt that familiar frustration of dealing with institutions designed to exhaust you until you surrender. We've all faced it in some way. The phone calls that go unanswered, the forms that are deliberately confusing, the faceless operators who say, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do." The film takes that everyday despair and magnifies it into tragedy. Outside the courtroom, the young lawyer's life is no less turbulent. His romance deepens with the woman he has quietly begun to love, but their bond is tested by the violence of her abusive husband. Their relationship is tender, almost fragile, moments of gentleness shared in the shadow of bruises and fear. For him, defending her becomes another kind of trial, one without juries or verdicts, only choices. When the violence escalates, he is forced to confront not only his feelings, but the reality that justice in the courtroom does not guarantee justice in life. These moments cut deeper than any legal argument, reminding us that the law can only reach so far, and that personal courage often begins where statutes end. The trial itself reaches a fever pitch as closing arguments near. By this point, our young lawyer has grown into his role, his voice steady, his eyes clear. He no longer trembles, he commands. He speaks directly to the jury, not as a lawyer, but as a human being appealing to their conscience. His words are not flowery but plain, almost raw, a plea for decency in a world drowning in greed. His opponent, slick and smug, counters with technicalities, but the contrast is glaring. It is sincerity against cynicism, humanity against machinery. When the verdict comes, it is thunderous. The jury rules against the insurance company, awarding damages so large that even the polished lawyers cannot hide their shock. It is a victory, yes, but not the kind Hollywood usually gives us. The company immediately announces plans to appeal, dragging the case into endless bureaucracy. The money, the justice, may never reach the family in time. The young boy remains gone. The parents remain broken. Victory here is not restoration, but recognition. The jury has spoken, but the world remains cruel. This bittersweet ending to the case is what elevates the story. It reminds us that even triumph carries shadows. Winning does not resurrect the dead or erase suffering. It does not dismantle systems built on indifference. But it matters. It matters because for once, the truth was spoken and heard. It matters because a corporation was forced to look into the mirror of its own cruelty. It matters because one young lawyer, once trembling and naive, proved that courage can exist even in futility. Parallel to this, the personal storylines find their own closure. The woman he loves finally breaks free from her abusive marriage, though not without cost. The decision is both painful and liberating, a reminder that freedom often comes through scars. Their relationship is left ambiguous, tender but uncertain, as though the future is still being written. The mentor, ever the cynic, smiles with weary pride, acknowledging that perhaps decency is not always doomed. And the protagonist himself, scarred but unbroken, walks away with a deeper understanding of what it means to fight. He has won and lost at the same time, and that paradox becomes his truth. The second half of the film, then, is less about victory than about growth. It is about learning that justice is rarely pure, that battles are rarely decisive, that the cost of integrity is always high. It is about discovering that sometimes the fight itself matters more than the outcome. Watching him walk out of the courtroom, I felt the weight of my own compromises, the times I chose ease over courage. The story whispers that such compromises are not inevitable, that we can, even in small ways, stand firm. The closing moments are subdued, almost quiet. No grand speeches, no sweeping music, just the image of a man older than his years, still young but already seasoned by fire. His face carries the knowledge that he cannot save everyone, but also the conviction that he must try. And that, for me, is where the power of the story lies. It is not a tale of victory, but of survival, not of triumph, but of endurance. It shows us that justice is not a destination, but a struggle, ongoing, relentless, and worth the fight. When the credits roll, I'm always left with the same feeling, a mix of hope and sadness, the recognition that the world is unjust, but that people, fragile and stubborn, can still carve moments of truth out of that injustice. It is not a feel-good ending, but it is a necessary one. It reminds us that law, like life, is flawed, messy, and often cruel. But within it, there is still space for courage, still room for the Rainmaker who dares to stand in the storm. Characters are the lifeblood of this story, and in this film, they are drawn with such a blend of vulnerability and contradiction that they linger long after the courtroom fades from memory. To analyze them is to step into a gallery of human struggles, ambition and fear, loyalty and betrayal, courage and exhaustion. Each figure is more than a narrative role. Each is a reflection of something we recognize in ourselves or in the people we've known. Their humanity is what makes the story sting, and their flaws are what make it real. At the center is the young lawyer, a character who embodies both the hope of youth and the bruises that come with stepping into reality. He begins the story as almost painfully earnest, armed with casebooks and ideals, convinced that justice is something you can carry like a torch into the darkest rooms. Watching him in those early moments, I remember my own first steps into adulthood, carrying beliefs too large for the spaces I walked into, colliding with walls I didn't know existed. He is naive, yes, but it's the kind of naivety born from faith, a belief that the world, at its core, is fair if you just fight hard enough. As the narrative unfolds, we see him reshaped by struggle. Each humiliation chisels away his illusions, but instead of breaking him, it tempers him. His strength is not brilliance, but persistence, not mastery of the law, but the refusal to surrender to cynicism. That's what makes him so relatable. He doesn't win because he is smarter than everyone else, but because he refuses to stop showing up. His transformation is subtle but profound. He shifts from idealism to resilience, from a boy who believes in fairness to a man who believes in fighting even when fairness is impossible. He is less a hero than a mirror, showing us what it means to hold on to decency in a world that punishes it. Standing beside him, though often in the shadows, is his mentor. This older lawyer is flamboyant, cynical, and faintly ridiculous. Yet he carries within him the ache of a man who once believed in ideals and has long since surrendered them. He becomes a foil for the protagonist. Where the rookie sees hope, he sees futility. Where the rookie sees justice, he sees bureaucracy. And yet, beneath his laughter and sarcasm, there's a flicker of admiration. He mocks the rookie's sincerity because it unsettles him. It reminds him of who he used to be. Their relationship is layered with both affection and irony. He teaches the rookie how the system really works, yet secretly hopes he proves him wrong. In many ways, he is the embodiment of compromise, the fate that awaits those who let the grind of institutions smother their fire. Then there is the woman whose life intersects with the protagonist's, a woman trapped in an abusive marriage. Her character is drawn not as a cliché, but as a deeply human figure, torn between fear and the longing for freedom. She represents another kind of courtroom, one without gavels or juries, the private battles fought in kitchens and bedrooms, where justice is even harder to win. Her relationship with the protagonist is tender, hesitant, shadowed by danger. For him, she is not simply a romantic subplot, but a moral test. To love her is to risk entanglement in violence, to invite complications that could derail his fragile career. Yet he cannot look away. In her, he sees the same injustice he fights in the courtroom: power crushing the vulnerable, cruelty silencing the innocent. She becomes both mirror and muse, forcing him to confront what it means to fight not just for clients, but for people. The family at the heart of the lawsuit provides the film's emotional core. They are ordinary in every way, working class, weary, struggling to navigate a system designed to confuse and exhaust them. Their son's illness strips them raw, reducing their lives to hospital rooms and unanswered phone calls. What makes them powerful as characters is their ordinariness. They are not activists or martyrs. They are parents trying to save their child. Their faith in the rookie is both heartbreaking and inspiring. They cling to him not because he is the best lawyer, but because he is the only one who listens. Their trust becomes both his burden and his strength, a weight that threatens to crush him but also drives him forward. Through them, the story reminds us that justice is not abstract. It is lived in bodies, in families, in the desperate prayers of people who have nowhere else to turn. The antagonists of the film are drawn with chilling precision. The corporate lawyers representing the insurance company are not villains in the cartoonish sense. They are worse. They are polite, well-dressed, and utterly indifferent. Their weapon is not rage, but apathy. Their cruelty not flamboyant, but bureaucratic. Watching them, I thought of the institutions I've dealt with in my own life, where "I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do" becomes a refrain that hides indifference behind a smile. Their menace lies in their normalcy, in the way they treat suffering as paperwork. They symbolize not just an opponent in a lawsuit, but the entire machinery of modern life that reduces human beings to numbers. Even the judge plays a symbolic role. He is weary, pragmatic, aware of the game, but unwilling to tilt the scales too far in any direction. He represents the law itself, not as a shining beacon of justice, but as a tired institution trying to balance chaos. His presence reminds us that justice in the courtroom is never pure. It is mediated by individuals, by procedures, by compromises. His rulings, sometimes favoring the rookie, sometimes the corporation, reinforce the theme that fairness is elusive, contingent, and fragile. Smaller characters flesh out the tapestry with surprising weight. A secretary who quietly helps the protagonist, a paralegal who admires his persistence, even the abusive husband whose violence shadows the romance. All of them add texture to the narrative. They remind us that no battle is fought in isolation, that every choice ripples outward into the lives of others. What fascinates me most about these characters is how they exist in a spectrum of compromise. The rookie clings to his ideals at great cost. His mentor has surrendered his. The corporate lawyers never had them. The woman he loves is learning to reclaim hers. The family fights desperately to preserve theirs in the face of loss. Each character becomes a reflection of what we do when faced with injustice. Fight, surrender, exploit, endure. Their interactions weave a complex moral map, one that refuses to simplify human behavior into good and evil. In the end, the characters' arcs converge on the idea that justice is less about winning and more about surviving with dignity. The rookie does not become a superhero. He becomes scarred but steadfast. His mentor remains cynical but quietly proud. The woman steps into freedom but carries her wounds. The family gains recognition but not restoration. The corporate lawyers remain unbroken, a reminder that systems outlive individuals. And yet, within these imperfect resolutions, we find something rare: authenticity. These characters do not give us neat endings. They give us truth. Their humanity lingers because it feels like our own. We know what it is to be naive, to be cynical, to be trapped, to be desperate. We know the exhaustion of fighting systems too large, the temptation to give up, the stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, decency can matter. This is why the characters resonate so deeply. They're not archetypes, they're us. And through them, the story whispers that even in the face of futility, integrity is worth the fight. There's a kind of poetry hidden in the strange details of how films are made. And with this one, the oddities reveal themselves like footnotes that almost tell their own story. When I think about the strangeness facts behind this courtroom drama, I don't picture scandals or chaos, but rather the ways small, unusual choices and coincidences added up to create the atmosphere we now remember. It's as if the making of the film echoed the very themes it explored: struggles between cynicism and idealism, between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between compromise and conviction. One of the strangest facts is how deeply the production leaned into authenticity. Courtroom dramas can often feel sterile, like sets built for the sake of camera angles. But here the filmmakers used real courthouses, often filming in cramped spaces that made shooting difficult. At the time, many thought it would be easier to construct sets on sound stages, but the director insisted on capturing the claustrophobic realism of small-town courtrooms. Crew members joked that they spent more time squeezing cameras through doors than actually rolling film. But those cramped conditions gave the trial sequences a documentary-like grit. When I watch those scenes now, I can almost feel the stale air of the room, the wood polished by decades of hands, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Another curious aspect lies in the casting. The young lawyer was portrayed by an actor who, by 1997, was on the cusp of stardom but hadn't yet cemented himself as a leading man. Some executives feared the role would be too small, too quiet, to showcase his talent. Yet it turned out to be a defining step in his career, proving he could balance vulnerability with conviction. Ironically, the casting process almost went another way. Another young actor, equally talented, was considered but passed over. Looking back, it's hard not to wonder how different the film would feel with a slightly altered face delivering those lines. But the final choice feels fated. His fragile earnestness is inseparable from the character's struggle. The mentor figure carried his own quirks. On set, he reportedly improvised much of his dialogue, embellishing his character with eccentricities that weren't in the script. Some of his lines that now feel iconic were ad-libbed between takes, captured because the director allowed cameras to keep rolling long after the official cut. In interviews, he admitted he loved playing with a kid, deliberately throwing curveballs to see how the young actor would react. That improvisational spirit gave their relationship an unpredictable energy, cynicism laced with affection, mockery softened with pride. It also created headaches for the continuity team, who scrambled to match ad-libbed gestures across takes. Then there's the dog that never was. Originally, the screenplay included a subplot with a protagonist rescued a stray dog, symbolizing his need to care for the vulnerable even in small ways. Scenes were even filmed, but ultimately cut in editing for pacing. The footage has never been released, but crew members recall that the dog became a kind of unofficial mascot on set, wandering through the courthouse during breaks and sleeping near the director's chair. Though the subplot vanished, the spirit of it lingers in the tone of the film, a reminder that kindness exists in small, almost invisible gestures. A particularly strange behind-the-scenes fact is how the insurance company at the center of the story reacted. While fictionalized, the plot was based on real practices of denial and delay by major corporations. After the film's release, some companies were reportedly so unnerved by the negative portrayal that they quietly altered their policies to avoid lawsuits. Imagine that, a work of fiction pressuring real-world corporations into reform. It's a testament to the odd ways stories can ripple outward, shaping behavior in places we don't expect. Even stranger is how real law schools began using the film in classrooms. Professors screened the courtroom sequences not as entertainment, but as case studies in ethics. Students debated whether the protagonist made the right decisions, whether his emotional appeals crossed professional lines, whether his passion clouded his judgment. What was meant as a drama became a teaching tool, a cinematic supplement to textbooks. To this day, I find that fascinating, that a film about a young lawyer stumbling his way through a case became, for some, a mirror for their own stumbling first steps into the profession. There were production quirks, too. One actor playing a corporate lawyer was so convincing in his smirking arrogance that extras, unaware of his off-screen kindness, genuinely disliked him during breaks. He would sit alone at lunch, reading quietly, until others realized he was nothing like his role. Another actor, cast as a judge, was so steeped in method that he insisted on being addressed as Your Honor for the entire shoot, even when cameras weren't rolling. Crew members humored him, half amused, half intimidated, and by the end of production, many confessed they couldn't shake the habit. The weather offered its own strange blessings. Several key scenes were meant to be shot on dry, sunny days, but sudden rainstorms forced last-minute adjustments. Instead of delaying, the director leaned into it, allowing the rain to streak windows and soak sidewalks. The mood shifted. What was meant to be bright became somber, reflective. Ironically, it made the film feel more aligned with its title. Those storms were unplanned, but became thematically perfect, adding a layer of atmosphere that no storyboard had anticipated. Editing revealed another curiosity. The original cut was nearly 4 hours long, sprawling with subplots and tangents. Much of it was trimmed, but fragments remain, a lingering shot here, a half-finished subplot there, that hint at the film it might have been. Some scenes that audiences now cherish were almost cut for time. The romance subplot, for instance, was initially deemed too distracting by studio notes. The director fought to keep it, insisting that without it, the film would lack emotional anchor. His stubbornness prevailed, and today those moments of quiet tenderness are among the most remembered. Perhaps the strangest fact of all lies in the audience reactions. At test screenings, viewers wept not only during the trial's climax, but during quieter moments. The mother clutching medical papers, the lawyer fumbling his words, the awkward silences that filled hospital corridors. Studio executives worried it meant the film was too bleak, but the director argued it proved authenticity. He believed audiences weren't moved by speeches or verdicts, but by the little fractures of humanity scattered throughout. Time has proven him right. The film's legacy endures not because of a verdict, but because of the people who carried it. And here's a final oddity. The book on which the film was based was itself inspired by real cases. Many assumed the novel exaggerated for drama, but legal historians have since confirmed that similar lawsuits did unfold, with families destroyed by corporate indifference. The fiction was barely fiction at all. It makes you wonder whether the strangest fact is not about filmmaking, but about reality. The way corporations gamble with lives, the way justice hinges on who can afford it, the way ordinary people are left clinging to fragile hope. The strangeness of this film, then, is not in scandals or accidents, but in the way it blurred boundaries between fiction and reality, performance and authenticity, cinema and ethics. The oddities, dogs cut from the script, rainstorms turned symbolic, improvisations turned iconic, are delightful. But the deepest strangeness is that a courtroom drama could ripple so far outward, touching corporations, classrooms, and consciences. That is the magic of storytelling. It starts as entertainment and becomes something else entirely, reshaping the very world it reflects. Critical perspectives on this story are like voices gathered in a long hallway, some soft with admiration, some sharp with critique, all echoing with the same question. What does this film really tell us about justice, about institutions, about people trying to survive within them? To explore these perspectives is to see how the film lives not just on screen, but in the minds of those who watched it, argued with it, taught it, even lived in the world it depicted. The movie events themselves become less about plot points and more about moments of moral confrontation, flashes where personal and collective meaning collide. One of the most common perspectives frames the film as a morality tale about innocence versus corruption. The young lawyer, fragile yet determined, embodies the idea of an idealist stepping into a battlefield designed to crush him. Opposite him stand the corporate attorneys, polished, practiced, armored with cynicism. The courtroom becomes less a stage for legal arguments and more a symbolic arena for morality itself. In this reading, the trial is not about insurance claims. It is about whether decency can survive when pitted against machinery. Critics who hold this view often compare the story to classic literature, the David and Goliath resonance of biblical tales, the weary tragedy of Steinbeck, the moral fury of Dickens. For them, the film succeeds as parable. Others approach it more skeptically, arguing that it indulges in sentimentality. They point out that while the protagonist's sincerity is moving, it risks oversimplifying the law, painting too neat a contrast between the noble rookie and the monstrous corporation. These critics worry that the story becomes too clean, too allegorical, smoothing over the messy ambiguity of real courtrooms. They ask, is it truly possible for one underdog to triumph against such odds, or does the film's fantasy risk misleading audiences into false hope? For them, the story falters when it leans into wish fulfillment rather than the complexity of systemic injustice. Another perspective emphasizes the film as a critique of institutions, not just corporations, but the entire apparatus of law. The judge, weary and pragmatic, represents the law itself, tired, uneven, constrained by procedure. The protagonist may win moments of sympathy, but even victories are bittersweet, undercut by appeals, bureaucracy, and the inevitability of delay. In this reading, the film is less about triumph and more about disillusionment. Its lesson is not that justice prevails, but that justice is always partial, fragile, compromised. I find this perspective particularly resonant. It reminds me of the times I've seen systems bend just enough to appear merciful, only to snap back into indifference the moment the spotlight fades. Some scholars, particularly those with backgrounds in literature, read the story as a meditation on voice. Who gets to be heard? The dying boy and his parents, initially silenced by paperwork, find their voices only through the lawyer who chooses to amplify them. The courtroom becomes an amplifier, but only for those persistent enough, or lucky enough, to find an advocate. In this reading, the film is not about one man's courage, but about the structural silencing of the powerless. The strange twist, of course, is that even when their voices are heard, it does not undo the loss. The boy still dies. Recognition comes, but restoration does not. For these critics, the film becomes a lament for all the voices drowned in silence, a reminder that storytelling itself, whether in law or in cinema, is an act of giving voice to the voiceless. Audience perspectives add another layer. Many ordinary viewers, not lawyers or critics, spoke about how the film mirrored their own frustrations with institutions. Letters poured into newspapers at the time of release from people who had battled insurance companies, hospitals, banks. They described the story not as fantasy, but as painfully accurate, a mirror held up to a culture where paperwork outweighs people. Some even said they cried not during the verdict, but during the smaller scenes, when the parents are brushed aside, when the phone calls go unanswered. Those moments, to them, were the real events of the film, the true indictments. And then there is the perspective that sees the narrative as a story of coming of age. The young lawyer's arc mirrors that of countless literary protagonists who step into adulthood by confronting disillusionment. He begins naive, hopeful, even foolish. By the end, he is sobered, scarred, yet not broken. His victory is not in the courtroom, but in himself. He discovers that integrity is worth carrying, even when the world punishes it. Critics who hold this view often compare him to figures like Holden Caulfield or Huck Finn, characters defined less by triumph than by transformation. When we look closely at the movie events themselves, we see why they invite such diverse readings. The early humiliation of the protagonist, forced to work under a hustler, is not just a plot device, but a symbolic baptism into corruption. The moment he takes the dying boy's case is framed almost like a vow, a declaration of faith against futility. The courtroom clashes are staged like duels, each objection and counterargument a battle in miniature. The verdict, with its thunderous recognition of the corporation's cruelty, is staged not as celebration, but as anticlimax, victory tinged with loss. Each of these events resonates differently depending on where we stand. As idealists, we cheer. As cynics, we sigh. As realists, we nod with weary recognition. The romance subplot, too, has been the subject of critical debate. Some see it as essential, grounding the protagonist's journey in the personal stakes of love and violence. Others dismiss it as distraction, an unnecessary addition to an already heavy story. But I find it significant precisely because it mirrors the courtroom. Just as he must fight for justice against corporations, he must also fight for compassion against cruelty in private life. The personal and professional are not separate. They bleed into each other, reminding us that morality is never confined to one arena. Violence, or rather the threat of violence, is another lens. While the courtroom is defined by verbal duels, the subplot of abuse introduces the raw brutality of physical harm. This juxtaposition highlights how injustice operates at every level, in institutions, in homes, in relationships. The protagonist's willingness to stand beside her, to risk entanglement, becomes as important as his willingness to stand beside his clients. Both are acts of courage. Both are affirmations that justice must be pursued wherever it is threatened. One of the most poignant critical perspectives is that the film is at heart about futility. The boy dies, the family remains broken, the corporation will appeal, the system will continue. And yet, it insists that fighting still matters. This paradox, victory in futility, is perhaps its most literary dimension. It reminds me of Camus' idea of the absurd hero, pushing the boulder uphill not because he expects success, but because the act itself affirms meaning. In this light, the young lawyer is less a victor than a struggler, and his value lies not in what he achieves, but in the fact that he keeps going. Audiences with legal backgrounds often critique the film for oversimplification. They note that real cases are messier, less dramatic, more drawn out. But even many of them admit that the emotional truth feels accurate. They recognize in the protagonist's exhaustion their own. They see in the corporate lawyers the colleagues who long ago traded compassion for billable hours. For them, the film is not instruction but catharsis, a chance to see the struggle dramatized, the moral stakes heightened, the exhaustion given meaning. Finally, there is a perspective that sees the film as a meta-commentary on storytelling itself. Just as the lawyer tells a story to the jury to win their hearts, the film tells a story to us to win ours. Both are acts of persuasion. Both are attempts to turn facts into meaning. In this reading, the film is less about law than about narrative. The way stories can shape perception, sway opinion, even create the possibility of justice where none seem possible. It asks us to consider, is justice, in the end, simply the most convincing story? Why sit with all these perspectives, the parable of innocence, the critique of institutions, the lament for silenced voices, the coming-of-age tale, the meditation on futility? I realize that the film's power lies precisely in its refusal to be just one thing. It is at once hopeful and bleak, inspiring and sobering. Its events resonate because they are layered, each moment carrying multiple meanings depending on how we choose to read it. And isn't that the essence of literature itself? Stories that refuse to be reduced, that insist on complexity, that linger because they mean more than one thing. Behind the courtroom drama we see on screen lies another story, one that hums with its own tension and oddities, the making of the film itself. To peel back that curtain is to discover a production shaped by meticulous research, unexpected improvisations, and the quiet determination to create a work that felt both cinematic and truthful. These production insights and fun facts show us how the film came into being, not as a sterile adaptation of a legal thriller, but as a living, breathing piece of art that continues to resonate. The first thing to know is that this project was adapted from a best-selling novel, and that brought its own kind of pressure. Legal dramas are notoriously difficult to adapt. There's a risk of bogging down in jargon, of losing audiences in paperwork and precedent. But the director had a gift for storytelling that elevated dialogue-heavy material into something compelling. He approached the adaptation like a sculptor, carving away what was unnecessary while preserving the emotional heart. What fascinated him most was not the technicalities of law, but the moral struggles of people caught within it. From day one, the focus was clear. This would not be a movie about statutes. It would be a movie about souls. Casting became one of the production's most interesting decisions. The young lawyer at the center was played by an actor who, at the time, was on the cusp of being one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. This role was different from the glamorous parts that might have been expected of him. Here, he was stripped of charm, placed in shabby apartments and awkward situations, asked to portray vulnerability rather than charisma. Studio executives worried audiences wouldn't embrace it, but the actor insisted on leaning into the rawness of the character, and that decision gave the film its emotional core. Looking back, many critics now consider it one of his finest early performances. The mentor figure, played with eccentric brilliance, brought levity and unpredictability to the set. The script provided a framework, but the actor often embellished lines, tossing unexpected barbs and jokes at his younger co-star. What audiences see as effortless chemistry was, in fact, born from those unscripted moments. Crew members recalled watching scenes unfold with wide eyes, unsure what the older actor would say next, but always thrilled at the spontaneity. The young lead had to stay on his toes, adjusting to improvised lines in real time. That energy carried into the finished film, giving their relationship a lived-in texture that no script could have manufactured. Production design leaned heavily into realism. Rather than building glossy sets, the team sought out real courthouses, law offices, and neighborhoods in Memphis, Tennessee. This choice lent the film its authentic atmosphere. Locals recognized their own streets and buildings, and many were hired as extras. Shooting on location was not easy. Real courtrooms are small, cramped, and filled with echoes, but the director believed the trade-off was worth it. "Law isn't glamorous," he once said. "It's paper, sweat, and waiting." That philosophy guided the look of the film. Wooden benches polished by use, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, stacks of paper looming in every corner. One of the stranger aspects of production involved weather. Several key outdoor scenes were filmed during a particularly stormy season, and rain often interrupted schedules. Instead of fighting it, the filmmakers leaned into it. Rainwater streaking windows, puddles reflecting neon, characters huddled under umbrellas, all became unplanned but thematically resonant details. Crew members joked that the weather was a character in the film, giving the story an added layer of mood that fit perfectly with its themes of endurance and struggle. The romance subplot carried its own production quirks. The actress cast as the abused wife immersed herself deeply in the role, researching domestic violence cases and speaking with survivors to capture the nuance of fear and resilience. On set, the crew was protective of her, aware of the heaviness she carried in those scenes. The chemistry between her and the lead actor grew out of that trust, producing tender moments that contrasted sharply with the bleakness of the courtroom. In interviews later, she spoke about how important it was to portray her character not as a victim stereotype, but as a full person, frightened, yes, but also brave, searching for a way out. Outside the courtroom, the film gives us glimpses of the city itself. Streets are lined with modest houses, diners glow in neon at night, hospitals hum with sterile light. These spaces ground the story in a working-class reality, a world far from the glossy skyscrapers often associated with legal dramas. The camera often frames the city with muted colors, emphasizing grit rather than glamour. Rain, when it falls, slicks the streets and deepens shadows, turning sidewalks into reflective pools. These choices create a mood that is less about spectacle and more about atmosphere, a reminder that this story belongs to ordinary people, not elites. One of the most powerful settings is the hospital where the dying boy and his family spend much of their time. The cinematography here leans into starkness, pale walls, beeping machines, the sterile glare of medical lights. But within that sterility, the camera finds intimacy. It lingers on the mother's trembling hands as she flips through paperwork, on the father's hollow stare as he waits for news. The sound design amplifies small noises, the hiss of oxygen, the rustle of sheets, so that silence becomes almost unbearable. Watching these scenes, you feel the crushing weight of institutional indifference, the way hospitals can become both sanctuaries and prisons. The romance subplot unfolds in quieter, more intimate spaces. Cafes, parks, kitchens, settings that feel lived in and unremarkable, yet charged with emotional weight. The cinematography softens here, bathing characters in warmer light, slowing the pacing. These choices create contrast. While the courtroom is rigid and harsh, the romance scenes offer moments of vulnerability and tenderness. They remind us that even amidst institutional battles, life continues in small, fragile gestures. Lighting plays a crucial role throughout. The protagonist is often framed in half-light, suggesting his position between innocence and experience. His opponents, the corporate lawyers, are usually bathed in harsh, flat light, emphasizing their cold professionalism. The mentor figure is lit with warmer tones, reflecting his flamboyance and world-weariness. And the abused wife is often shown in shadow, her face partially obscured, symbolizing both her fear and her longing for escape. These lighting choices turn every scene into a psychological portrait, telling us as much about the characters' inner lives as their dialogue does. Editing reinforces the film's themes of endurance. Courtroom sequences stretch, emphasizing the monotony of legal proceedings. Depositions drag, objections repeat, motions stall. The pacing makes us feel the grind of the system. Yet when breakthroughs occur, a witness cracking, a revelation surfacing, the editing quickens, cutting more sharply, amplifying tension. This rhythm mirrors the experience of struggle itself. Long periods of exhaustion punctuated by sudden bursts of clarity. Sound design, too, adds layers of meaning. In the courtroom, silence is as important as dialogue. The hush after an objection, the pause before a verdict. These silences hang heavy, pressing on the viewer. Outside, the hum of the city, the patter of rain, the murmur of diners, all create a backdrop of ordinariness against which extraordinary struggles unfold. Even the soundtrack is restrained, often fading into the background rather than overwhelming the story. This minimalism allows the weight of human voices to dominate, reminding us that justice is argued not with music, but with words. Symbolism is woven into these settings. The apartment symbolizes fragility. The law office symbolizes disillusionment. The courtroom symbolizes endurance. The hospital symbolizes suffering. The romance settings symbolize hope. Together, they form a map of the protagonist's journey from naive idealism to scarred resilience. The cinematography, lighting, editing, and sound all serve to reinforce this map, guiding us not only through events but through emotional states. What strikes me most, though, is how ordinary everything looks. There are no grand cityscapes, no polished sets, no glossy stylization. And yet, within that ordinariness, the film finds profound meaning. It reminds us that the greatest battles are often fought in dull rooms with buzzing lights, that heroism doesn't always wear a cape, but sometimes just a wrinkled suit. It insists that the mundane is worthy of cinematic attention, that dignity can be found even in the most unremarkable spaces. In the end, the settings and cinematic elements of this film are not just backdrops. They are participants. They shape mood, mirror character, symbolize theme. They remind us that justice is not abstract, but lived in places we know, apartments, offices, hospitals, courtrooms. And they remind us that cinema, at its best, can take those places and reveal their hidden beauty, their hidden cruelty, their hidden truth. Behind every finished film lies a second story, the story of its making. With this one, that behind-the-scenes tale is rich with the same contradictions, struggles, and unexpected moments of grace that pulse through the drama itself. To linger here is to see how the actors, crew, and director all wrestled with questions not so different from those faced by the characters on screen. How to remain authentic in a world that rewards shortcuts. How to balance commerce with conscience. How to find truth in performance. Production began in the mid-1990s, when legal thrillers were at the height of their popularity. Adaptations of novels by a certain best-selling author were box office staples, but there was a danger of formula. Courtroom scenes played like television episodes, predictable and overpolished. The director of this project, known for his ability to juggle intimate character work with sweeping narratives, wanted to avoid that trap. His first instruction to the crew was simple: make it real. He didn't want glossy sets. He didn't want grandiose speeches drowning in music. He wanted sweat, paper, and silence. He told his production designer to go to Memphis, not Los Angeles soundstages, and find real courthouses, real apartments, real diners. If people recognize their own town, he said, they'll believe the story before we tell it. That choice set the tone for everything that followed. Shooting on location came with headaches, cramped spaces, limited lighting options, unpredictable weather. But it also grounded the film in authenticity. Local extras filled courtrooms, diners, and sidewalks. Crew members recalled how townsfolk would gather outside shooting locations, watching with quiet pride as their city was transformed into a cinematic landscape. Some locals even ended up on screen, their faces immortalized as jurors or passersby. The antagonists of the story, the corporate lawyers, were cast with equal care. Their performances required subtlety, not cartoon villains, but professionals so polished in their indifference that they became chilling. One actor, known off-screen for his warmth, was so convincing in his smugness that extras avoided him during breaks. He later laughed about it, admitting he had never been so disliked on set. The director encouraged this aura of intimidation, urging the actors to lean into their characters' callousness without ever raising their voices. The scariest thing, he told them, is someone who destroys lives politely. Filming the courtroom sequences was grueling. Long hours, endless takes, and the need to capture dialogue-heavy scenes from multiple angles tested everyone's patience. Yet the director's insistence on authenticity paid off. The rhythm of boredom, punctuated by sudden bursts of intensity, mirrored real trials. Actors often sat in the background for hours, pretending to listen while waiting for their turn to speak. Many later confessed that this monotony helped them stay in character, feeling the exhaustion their roles demanded. Editing the film presented its own challenges. The initial cut was nearly 4 hours long, sprawling with subplots from the novel. The editor worked tirelessly to shape it into a tighter, more focused narrative. Some entire storylines were cut, including a subplot involving a stray dog, which crew members fondly remembered but admitted slowed the pace. The final version retained only what was essential to the moral and emotional arc. Even then, the pacing was deliberately slower than most courtroom dramas, allowing audiences to live inside the grind of the case rather than rushing to the verdict. One of the most fun facts about the production is how often the crew found themselves playing extras. Courtrooms required jurors, clerks, spectators, and not every day could bring enough local hires. So camera operators, set designers, and even assistant directors sometimes donned suits and sat in the background. Eagle-eyed viewers can spot familiar crew members in multiple roles across different scenes. It became a running joke on set, with some crew members competing to see how many different disguises they could pull off. The film score also carried quirks. Rather than leaning on dramatic orchestration, the music was subdued, almost minimalist. The composer wanted it to feel like the hum of the world rather than a spotlight on the story. Some cues were so subtle that audiences later admitted they weren't sure if music had been playing at all. This restraint was intentional, designed to let dialogue and silence carry the weight. In test screenings, a few executives pushed for more overt scoring, but the director held firm. "This story doesn't need violins telling you when to cry," he said. The film's reception at the time of release was shaped by its production choices. Critics praised its authenticity, its refusal to glamorize the law, its focus on human stories rather than courtroom theatrics. Some complained about its pacing, but even they acknowledged the sincerity of its execution. Audiences connected most strongly with the emotional performances, particularly the lead actor's quiet vulnerability and the raw strength of the supporting cast. The film earned praise not just as entertainment, but as a meditation on ethics, often cited in classrooms as a tool for discussing legal and moral dilemmas. And perhaps the strangest fun fact of all is how the film rippled beyond Hollywood. In the years following its release, several real-world lawyers confessed that it had inspired them to take on cases they might otherwise have avoided. One attorney even admitted in an interview that he kept a poster of the film in his office as a reminder of why he entered the profession. For a piece of fiction to seep into real legal practice, shaping decisions, influencing careers, is a testament to its reach. Looking back now, the production story feels almost like an extension of the film's themes. It was not smooth, not easy, not glamorous. It was messy, unpredictable, marked by rainstorms, improvisations, and endless compromises. But it was also filled with persistence, sincerity, and small acts of courage. Just like the young lawyer in the story, the filmmakers faced obstacles and refused to give in. They believed in the worth of what they were making, even when it seemed impractical. And in the end, that belief carried through the screen, giving us a film that still resonates. The world of this story is not built on sweeping vistas or fantastical landscapes. It is grounded, ordinary, even drab. And yet, in the hands of a thoughtful director and cinematographer, those ordinary spaces become charged with meaning. To examine the settings and cinematic elements here is to realize how carefully the film transforms the banal into the symbolic, how it takes fluorescent-lit courtrooms, entire neighborhoods, and renders them into mirrors of character and theme. The first setting that lingers in the mind is the young lawyer's shabby apartment. It is small, underfurnished, a space where ambition collides with reality. The peeling paint, the cluttered desk, the thin mattress, all speak to the fragility of his situation. In cinematic terms, the apartment becomes a stage for his solitude, the place where he rehearses arguments to no one, where he stares at bills, where he confronts the gap between who he wants to be and who he is. The cinematography here is subdued, often lit with soft lamps or natural light leaking through blinds. Shadows pool in corners, emphasizing isolation. Watching these scenes, I always felt the weight of my own early struggles, the apartments I lived in when money was scarce, the rooms that seemed to echo with doubt. Then comes the law office where he first finds work, run by a hustler more concerned with profit than principle. This space is cluttered not with books or plaques, but with the detritus of opportunism, brochures, advertisements, and cheap suits. The camera lingers on small details, the way papers pile haphazardly on desks, the garish posters promising quick settlements, the clinking of cheap coffee mugs. The office feels less like a place of justice than a carnival booth, and the cinematography frames it accordingly, often with wider shots that highlight its chaos. It symbolizes the disillusionment that greets the protagonist at the start of his career, the law not as a noble calling, but as a marketplace. The courtroom, however, is the film's central setting, and it is depicted with remarkable restraint. Unlike many legal dramas that lean into grandeur, this courtroom is ordinary, even cramped. Wooden benches, buzzing fluorescent lights, worn carpets. It feels like a real space where real cases are fought, not a stage for melodrama. The cinematography avoids sweeping crane shots, opting instead for steady, patient framing that mirrors the slow grind of the trial. Wide shots capture the jury's shifting expressions, while close-ups emphasize the sweat on brows, the tremor in hands, the weight of words. The sound design here is equally restrained. The shuffle of papers, the echo of footsteps, the sharp crack of a gavel. These choices remind us that justice is not glamorous. It is exhausting, tedious, and human. Casting carried its own behind-the-scenes drama. The role of the young lawyer was hotly contested, with several rising actors auditioning. Ultimately, The part went to an actor who was just beginning to step into leading man territory. On set, he threw himself into the role with startling commitment. Crew members described how he spent weeks shadowing real law students and young attorneys, scribbling notes in the margins of scripts, rehearsing arguments out loud during breaks. He confessed privately that he was terrified of looking inexperienced, terrified of mishandling the gravity of the role. That fear bled into his performance, giving it the raw vulnerability that audiences later praised. His counterpart, the mentor figure, approached the project differently. Already a legend, he treated the set like a playground, tossing improvisations in every take, cracking jokes between setups, and keeping everyone, actors and crew alike, on their toes. One day, during a particularly tense courtroom sequence, he ad-libbed an entire mini-speech that wasn't in the script. The director loved it so much he kept it in the final cut. The young lead admitted later that those improvisations sometimes rattled him, but in hindsight, they sharpened his instincts, forcing him to stay present in every moment. The actress who played the abused wife brought an almost painful realism to her role. Before shooting, she spent time with women's advocacy groups, listening to stories of survival and loss. On set, she carried those stories heavily, and the crew noticed how quiet she became during filming days focused on her subplot. To support her, the cast and crew developed a protective camaraderie, checking in, lightening the mood when possible, ensuring that her heavy emotional labor was respected. The tenderness visible on screen between her and the protagonist grew out of that atmosphere of care. Even the antagonists had their own quirks. The actors cast as corporate lawyers were instructed to avoid melodrama. Instead, the director told them, "Be polite, be professional. That's scarier than shouting." To embody that, they studied real depositions, mimicking the clipped, efficient body language of corporate attorneys. Their performances became so convincing that extras genuinely bristled at them between takes, mistaking actors for the roles they played. One actor later joked that it was the loneliest set he'd ever worked on. No one wanted to share lunch with the villain. There were accidents, too, that shaped the film in surprising ways. Rainstorms repeatedly interrupted outdoor shoots. Rather than reschedule, the crew leaned into the weather, using wet sidewalks and gray skies to underscore mood. In one memorable scene, the protagonist trudges through puddles toward a courthouse, his reflection rippling with each step. That image wasn't storyboard. It was a gift of circumstance. The cinematographer later said it became one of his favorite shots of his career. The courtroom sequences, which dominate the film, were both exhausting and exhilarating to shoot. Trials require long days of dialogue, and to capture every angle, jury, judge, witnesses, lawyers, meant endless takes. Actors often sat silently in the background for hours, maintaining focus. To keep energy alive, the director encouraged the cast to treat each take as if the trial were real, never repeating gestures exactly. This method created subtle variations that gave the editing room a wealth of options. It also meant tempers sometimes flared. One day, after a 12-hour stretch of testimony scenes, an actor snapped at a crew member for shuffling papers too loudly. The outburst was quickly forgiven, but it highlighted the intensity of living in a courtroom day after day. Offset, the mood was lighter. Cast members gathered in Memphis restaurants, playing pool, eating barbecue, and laughing about the day's frustrations. Locals often spotted them, bemused at the sight of famous actors blending into their small city. Crew members remember late-night walks along quiet streets, the kind of downtime that built bonds. Many later described the shoot as one of the most cohesive experiences of their careers. Not glamorous, but deeply human. Editing brought its own surprises. The first cut ran close to 4 hours, packed with subplots from the novel. The director and editor spent months carving it down, preserving only what was essential. Some beloved scenes were lost. An entire subplot involving the young lawyer's bond with a stray dog was filmed but cut. Crew members still talk about that dog, who became a mascot on set, lounging near the director's chair during takes. Though the subplot vanished, traces of its tenderness remain in the film's tone. The score, too, was unconventional. Instead of sweeping orchestration, the composer crafted a restrained, almost invisible soundtrack. He wanted the hum of the courtroom, the shuffle of papers, the creak of benches to dominate. At one point, executives begged for more dramatic cues, but the director refused. "The silence is the score," he insisted. That choice gave the film its haunting realism. And then came the reception. Critics praised its authenticity, its refusal to glamorize the law, its focus on ordinary people. Some viewers complained it was too bleak, too slow, too heavy with moral weight. But many others embraced it as one of the finest legal dramas of its era. Law schools began screening it for students, sparking debates about ethics. Ordinary viewers saw their own struggles reflected in its depiction of institutions. The strangest thing of all was how a fictional film nudged real-world corporations to rethink their practices, wary of lawsuits sparked by the outrage it stirred. Looking back now, the behind-the-scenes story feels like a microcosm of the film itself. It was a production defined not by spectacle, but by persistence, not by gloss, but by grit. It was filled with improvisations, accidents, and small acts of care that shaped the final product. Just as the protagonist learns that integrity is forged in difficulty, the filmmakers discovered that authenticity is born in constraint. In the end, the making of this film was not glamorous, but it was genuine. It was about actors taking risks, crews embracing imperfections, a director holding the line on authenticity, and a city lending its streets to a story larger than itself. That truth, the behind-the-scenes endurance, the fun facts that humanize the process, is what gives the finished film its enduring resonance. Themes in this story move quietly, like undercurrents beneath a river, sometimes invisible, sometimes crashing against the rocks, always carrying the characters downstream, whether they realize it or not. To sit with them is to realize that this film is not merely about lawyers or cases or verdicts. It is about the human struggle against indifference, the fragility of idealism in the face of corruption, and the stubborn persistence of decency even when defeat seems inevitable. Symbolism is threaded through the settings, the gestures, the smallest choices, turning a legal drama into something closer to literature, an allegory for life itself. For me, this is why the film resonates so deeply. Its themes are not confined to lawyers or lawsuits. They are universal. We all wrestle with power, with futility, with compromise. We all face moments when our voices are silenced, when our ideals are eroded, when our victories feel bittersweet. And we all must decide whether to surrender or to persist. The symbols remind us that these struggles are not abstract. They live in our homes, our workplaces, our cities, our silences. The film's themes and symbolism transform it from a courtroom drama into a meditation on life. It is less about a verdict than about the question, what do we do when justice is impossible? The answer it offers is both sobering and hopeful. We fight anyway, because in the fight itself lies our humanity. Filmmaking in this story was never about spectacle. It was about stripping away the polish and digging into the grit of everyday life. Those fluorescent lit spaces where people wait for justice, those rain-soaked sidewalks where hope feels as fragile as an umbrella in a storm. To talk about the techniques behind the film is to understand how every choice, the camera, the sound, the pacing, was bent toward authenticity. And when we fold in the box office story, we see how this modest drama carved its own surprising place in an era dominated by flashier blockbusters. The cinematography is the first thing worth noticing. Many courtroom dramas opt for grandeur, wide shots that exaggerate the scale of justice, or stylized angles that turn trials into theater. Here, the approach is almost the opposite. The camera often sits at eye level, patient, unobtrusive, making us feel as though we are in the jury box ourselves. Close-ups capture the tremor in a hand, the flicker of doubt in a lawyer's eyes, the fatigue etched on a witness's face. Wide shots, when they come, emphasize not majesty but monotony. The repetition of benches, the blandness of paneling, the the sheer ordinariness of the room. This choice grounds the story in realism, refusing to romanticize the courtroom. Lighting follows the same philosophy. The film resists glossy sheen, embracing instead the stark glare of fluorescence, the dim glow of desk lamps, the soft wash of rain-filtered daylight. In the hospital, lights are sterile, cold, almost unforgiving. In the protagonist's apartment, shadows gather in corners, symbolizing both poverty and solitude. The abused wife is often lit partially in shadow, her fear and silence expressed visually before she ever speaks. By contrast, the corporate offices gleam with harsh, flat light, everything exposed, yet nothing humane. Lighting here is less aesthetic than symbolic, turning spaces into psychological portraits. Sound design carries unusual restraint. Instead of orchestral swells, we hear the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, the clearing of throats. Silence is used as punctuation, pauses after objections, breaths before verdicts. When music enters, it does so sparingly, almost invisibly, often more atmospheric than melodic. This restraint forces us to lean into dialogue and performance, making every word feel weighted. During outdoor scenes, ambient noise, the patter of rain, the hum of traffic, the murmur of diners, grounds us in ordinariness. Sound does not tell us what to feel. It immerses us in the textures of the world. Editing reinforces the grind of justice. The pacing is deliberately slow in courtroom sequences, lingering on procedures, motions, objections. It mirrors the tedium of real trials, the exhaustion of legal battles fought inch by inch. But when breakthroughs occur, when a witness cracks, when a revelation surfaces, the editing tightens, accelerating rhythm to emphasize tension. This contrast between monotony and urgency reflects the emotional reality of the case. Long stretches of weariness punctuated by sudden bursts of clarity. Performance technique is central to the film's impact. The young lead actor embraced vulnerability, allowing his nerves to show rather than hiding them. In early courtroom scenes, his voice trembles, his posture falters, his words stumble. These choices, though risky, mirror the character's arc. As the trial progresses, his delivery steadies, his gaze sharpens, his presence grows. The transformation feels earned because it emerges from visible struggle. By contrast, the actors playing corporate lawyers embody composure. Smooth, unflappable, almost robotic. Their calmness becomes sinister, a mask of civility concealing cruelty. The contrast between trembling sincerity and polished indifference is what gives the trial its electricity. The camera often frames these performances to reinforce themes. The protagonist is frequently shown against stacks of papers or in cramped spaces, dwarfed by the machinery around him. The corporate lawyers are framed in symmetrical compositions, their orderliness mirroring institutional power. The abused wife is often framed through doorways or behind barriers, symbolizing her entrapment. The mentor figure, flamboyant and world-weary, is given looser framing, his gestures spilling beyond the neatness of composition, reflecting his irreverence. These choices are subtle, but they embed meaning in every shot. Filmmaking also leaned heavily on location. Rather than build glossy sets, the production team used real courthouses, diners, and neighborhoods in Memphis. This choice gave the film its authenticity, but also posed challenges. Cramped spaces limited camera movement, and lighting had to be improvised around existing fixtures. Yet these limitations became strengths. The cramped framing made us feel the suffocation of bureaucracy. The improvised lighting heightened realism. The city itself became a character, its rain-soaked streets and modest homes grounding the story in working-class reality. One fun detail lies in the use of weather. Rainstorms repeatedly disrupted shooting, but instead of rescheduling, the director embraced them. Characters trudging through puddles, reflections rippling on sidewalks, raindrops streaking courthouse windows, all became unplanned but thematically resonant images. The weather added texture and symbolism, reinforcing the idea of persistence in storms. Crew members later joked that the rain was the film's most reliable supporting actor. Practicality extended to props and costumes. The protagonist's suit is slightly ill-fitting, his ties modest, his shoes worn, costume design as character development. The corporate lawyer's wardrobes, by contrast, are immaculate, their crispness reinforcing their detachment from struggle. Papers, binders, and medical files are treated almost as props with weight. They clutter desks, spill from briefcases, dominate frames. These objects symbolize bureaucracy as antagonists, mountains of paper that bury human suffering beneath them. The most visible theme is justice versus power. The young lawyer represents the yearning for fairness, for a world where the vulnerable are protected. He carries the idealism of someone who still believes law exists to serve people. Opposing him is the insurance company, not portrayed as a cartoon villain, but as a machine, cold, efficient, impersonal. Its representatives don't need to rant or rage. Their weapon is bureaucracy. They win by exhaustion, by delay, by endless paperwork. The clash between one fragile man and a faceless machine embodies the larger theme. What chance does justice have when power belongs to those who profit from delay? This question echoes long after the credits roll, because we've all felt it in hospitals, in banks, in workplaces, moments when institutions loomed larger than people. Another theme is idealism and its erosion. The protagonist begins with wide eyes, carrying the belief that decency can carry the day. Each humiliation, working under a hustler, watching clients brushed aside, stumbling in court, chips away at that idealism. Yet rather than destroying him, the erosion reshapes him. He grows less naive but more resilient, less hopeful of easy victories but more determined to fight even in futility. This theme resonates with anyone who has stepped into adulthood and realized the gap between the world we imagine and the world we inherit. It asks us, what do we do when the shine wears off? Do we surrender, or do we persist in another form? The theme of voice is equally central. The dying boy and his parents have no platform. Their pleas vanish in phone lines and denial letters. It is only through the lawyer's voice that they are heard. The courtroom becomes not just a legal stage, but a symbolic megaphone, amplifying voices that would otherwise remain silent. Yet even here, the victory is bittersweet. The boy still dies. The family is still broken. Their voices are recognized, but not restored. The theme reminds us that voice matters, but it is not always enough. It is both empowerment and lament. Closely tied to this is the theme of futility. The jury rules against the corporation, awarding damages that make headlines, yet the company appeals, dragging the case into endless bureaucracy. Justice is declared but not delivered. This paradox, winning and losing at once, is perhaps the film's most haunting theme. It suggests that justice is not a final state, but a struggle, one that must be fought again and again, often without clear resolution. Watching this, I thought of Camus' image of Sisyphus, pushing the boulder uphill, not because he expects it to stay, but because the act of pushing gives meaning. Friendship and mentorship provide another layer. The flamboyant older lawyer embodies cynicism, mocking the rookie's sincerity while secretly admiring it. Their dynamic reflects the theme of compromise. What happens when youthful fire meets weary pragmatism? The mentor represents what the protagonist might become if he surrenders his ideals. Yet their bond, filled with banter and irony, also suggests that even cynics yearn to see hope survive. It is a theme about inheritance, not of wealth or power, but of belief. The romance subplot expands the film's thematic reach. The abused wife's struggle mirrors the larger battle in the courtroom. Just as the protagonist fights institutions that crush the weak, he also confronts the personal injustice of domestic violence. Her journey symbolizes resilience, the struggle to reclaim dignity in the face of fear. Together, Their relationship affirms that justice is not confined to law books, but lived in homes, in private choices, in acts of protection and care. The theme insists that morality is holistic. You cannot fight for fairness in court and ignore cruelty at home. Symbolism runs like a subtle current beneath these themes. The protagonist's apartment, bare and shabby, symbolizes fragility. It reminds us that his fight is not from a place of comfort, but of vulnerability. The courthouse, cramped and fluorescent lit, symbolizes the grind of justice. Far from glamorous, heavy with monotony. The insurance company's offices, polished and impersonal, symbolize power sanitized into normalcy, cruelty disguised as professionalism. The hospital, with its sterile halls and beeping machines, symbolizes both suffering and indifference, a place where life and bureaucracy collide. Even smaller objects carry symbolic weight. The piles of paperwork symbolize the crushing force of bureaucracy, so vast it becomes its own antagonist. The photographs of the dying boy, clutched by his parents, symbolize the human cost buried beneath statistics. The rain, often unplanned but embraced in filming, becomes symbolic of cleansing and persistence. It falls on everyone, lawyer, client, corporation alike, reminding us of shared vulnerability, of storms we all endure. Lighting, too, serves symbolic purpose. The protagonist is often half-lit, his face caught between shadow and glow, symbolizing his position between innocence and experience. The corporate lawyers are bathed in harsh, flat light, their features exposed, but their humanity absent. The abused wife is often framed in shadow, her partial obscurity symbolizing her silenced voice, her hidden pain. The mentor is lit warmly, reflecting both his flamboyance and his faded idealism. These choices embed symbolism into the very texture of the film. Another layer of symbolism lies in silence. Courtroom scenes are punctuated not only by speeches, but by pauses, the hush after an objection, the breath before a verdict. Silence becomes a symbol of weight, of the gaps between words where truth lingers. Outside, the hum of the city, the patter of rain, the murmur of diners all symbolize ordinariness, the backdrop against which extraordinary struggles unfold. Thematically, the film also explores the tension between public and private justice. The courtroom delivers verdicts, but personal lives deliver different kinds of justice or injustice. The protagonist may win against a corporation, but still wrestles with loneliness and doubt. The woman he loves may escape her marriage, but carries scars that no verdict can erase. The theme insists that justice is multifaceted, legal, emotional, personal, and that no single arena can encompass it all. Ultimately, all these themes and symbols converge on one idea: integrity. What does it mean to live with integrity in a world that punishes it? The protagonist answers not by winning everything. He doesn't, but by refusing to surrender his decency. The symbols reinforce this truth. The apartment, the courthouse, the rain, the silences all whisper that integrity is fragile yet indestructible. It can be bruised, mocked, delayed, but it cannot be erased if we refuse to give it up. The director, in his interviews, was candid about his vision. He admitted that he wanted to make a courtroom drama that resisted spectacle. Most courtroom movies are about the big speech, the dramatic verdict, he said. But real law is about paperwork, fatigue, waiting. I wanted to capture that grind without losing the human story. He defended the film's bittersweet ending, acknowledging that some viewers wanted a cleaner resolution. Life doesn't give clean resolutions, he said simply. Why should art? Audience reactions were as layered as the film itself. In theaters, viewers wept not only during the climax, but during smaller moments. The mother clutching medical forms, the protagonist fumbling through his first arguments, the silence in hospital hallways. Letters poured into newspapers from people who had battled insurance companies or other institutions. For them, the film was not fantasy, but recognition. That was my life, one viewer wrote. The endless calls, the denial letters, the feeling that no one cared. These reactions revealed how deeply the film resonated with ordinary struggles, turning personal pain into collective catharsis. Lawyers, too, responded strongly. Some praised its authenticity, noting how it captured the exhaustion of litigation more honestly than most legal dramas. Others criticized it for oversimplification, arguing that real cases are even messier, even slower, even less satisfying. Yet even critics admitted that the emotional truth felt accurate. Law schools began screening the film for students, using it as a springboard for discussions about ethics, responsibility, and the human cost of law. Professors asked students, would you take a case like this, knowing it could drain you? Would you compromise to survive, or cling to principle and risk losing everything? The film became not just entertainment, but pedagogy. Critics, meanwhile, were divided but fascinated. Some hailed it as one of the best adaptations of its author's novels, praising its restraint, its sincerity, its performances. Others found it too slow, too bleak, too morally heavy-handed. Yet almost everyone agreed that it lingered, that it refused to vanish after the credits. It was not a film easily dismissed. Even negative reviews often admitted admiration for the performances, particularly the young lead's vulnerability and the supporting cast's authenticity. Audience reviews outside the critical sphere added another layer of intimacy. Many spoke about how the film mirrored their own lives. Parents fighting for medical coverage, employees battling corporations, individuals trapped in systems too vast to comprehend. One viewer wrote that she cried not at the verdict, but at the scene where the lawyer sits silently across from the family, realizing the weight of their trust. That silence, she said, was my whole life, waiting for someone to help, hoping they wouldn't give up. In later years, interviews with the cast revealed how the film continued to shape their careers. The young lead credited it with teaching him the value of vulnerability on screen. The mentor figure called it one of his most enjoyable shoots, praising the camaraderie in Memphis and the honesty of the script. The actress said it remained one of her most meaningful roles, not because of fame, but because of the survivors who later told her they felt seen. Even the actors who played villains expressed pride, knowing they had contributed to a story that provoked such strong moral conversations. What emerges from these voices, cast, critics, audiences, is a portrait of a film that transcended its genre. It was more than a courtroom drama. It was a meditation on ethics, a mirror for real-world struggles, a catalyst for conversation. The cast poured fragments of themselves into their roles: fear, cynicism, tenderness, and audiences found those fragments reflected in their own lives. Interviews revealed the vulnerability behind the performances, the improvisations that gave scenes their edge, the personal research that lent authenticity. Audience reviews confirmed that the film struck nerves not because it was perfect, but because it was real. In the end, the story of cast and reception is much like the story told in the film itself, a reminder that voices matter. The voices of actors who risked vulnerability. The voices of critics who debated meaning. The voices of audiences who saw their own struggles mirrored. Together, they transformed the film from entertainment into dialogue, from story into conversation. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy a film can leave. Not just images, but voices that echo long after the final frame. Conclusions are never really endings. They're summations, echoes, the place where all the threads we've been tracing finally knot together into a shape that feels both inevitable and unfinished. That is the feeling I carry when I think about this story. On the surface, it was a courtroom drama, a film about lawyers and trials and verdicts. But the deeper we have gone together, the clearer it becomes that it was never about law at all. It was about integrity, voice, and the stubborn refusal to let cynicism be the final word. To bring this exploration to a close is to reflect on those truths and on the strange power of cinema to make them live in us. The introduction invited us into a world where a young, untested lawyer took on an opponent far larger than himself. From the beginning, we recognized him, not as a hero, not as a genius, but as someone trembling, uncertain, idealistic. He embodied what it feels like to step into adulthood carrying ideals that seem too fragile for the world. His shabby apartment, his faltering arguments, his awkwardness in court. These were not flaws, but mirrors, reflecting the parts of ourselves that doubt whether we belong in the rooms we've worked so hard to enter. The overview revealed that this was no tale of guaranteed triumph, but of struggle, of persistence in the face of exhaustion. The first half of the plot showed us disillusionment in detail. We watched as he stumbled into a profession that promised nobility but delivered cynicism, as he endured the humiliations of working for hustlers, as he faced the machinery of corporations that reduced lives to forms and signatures. Yet even there, in that bleakness, he found something worth fighting for, a family devastated by the indifference of an insurance company. Their trust in him was fragile, but it became his compass. That first half taught us that stories often begin not with victory, but with vulnerability, and that courage grows in the soil of doubt. The second half brought us into the crucible of trial. We saw him transform, not into a flawless litigator, but into someone who found his voice by refusing to let silence win. The courtroom sequences, filmed with patience and grit, reminded us that justice is not grand but grueling. His victory was not clean. It was bittersweet, undercut by appeals, shadowed by loss. The boy still died. The family remained broken. The system continued. And yet, something shifted. A jury recognized cruelty. A corporation was forced to confront its reflection. A man discovered that integrity is worth carrying even when outcomes disappoint. That paradox, victory within futility, is the truth the film leaves us with.